On today's World Insight, Beijing in the grips of a mammoth sandstorm, freak weather, an effect of global climate change, a visit to Seoul and Tokyo this week with a top U.S. diplomat and defense chief, their first visit to Asia since taking office. What's on the agenda? And Syria comes to grips with a decade of ceaseless conflict and humanitarian crisis. Any end to the war in sight?
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Thick dust covered the Chinese capital Beijing in a yellow and orange hue on Monday morning with visibility less than 1 kilometer. The city's weather bureau issued a yellow warning for sandstorms, the third most hazardous level. Weather reports said the sandstorm blew from North China's Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region due to cyclones and strong winds. Meanwhile, in Mongolia, authorities said powerful sandstorms in the south had killed 6 people, while at least 80 others were missing. Heavy dust and snowstorms have hit large parts of China since Friday night, with a maximum wind speed of more than 120 kilometers per hour. More on that. We are joined in Beijing by Ma Jun, director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs. He's also the founder of the Blue Map app. Why? Many ask this question, Mr. Ma. After years, it seems that things are getting better. I mean, there will be smaller scale sandstorm and sometimes even no sandstorm during the springtime, but this time almost unprecedented over the past few years.
Yeah, this is the worst sandstorm over the past nearly 11 years. We have seen in some locations, not far from Beijing, the PM10 or the respirable particulates, the concentration have topped 11,000 micrograms. 600 micrograms is beyond index already. In the center part of Beijing, it also at one moment approached to 10,000. So it's very, very high. And so with such a kind of a sand and dust storm, there are natural reasons behind that. The very strong wind from Mongolia Plateau. And then in the local regions, we have seen a rising temperature, quite unusual in comparison with the average. And it's suspected that there's more melting ice and snow, so more land has been exposed. So more dust and sand and dust have been exposed, and with the strong wind be carried out.
Now, this is really related to China's plan to work something out with this environment. So how will, issues like this, what we are experiencing today, this huge sandstorm, unprecedented over the years, be able to help us clarify our goals even better?
I mean, over the past 7-8 years, China has been carrying out a unprecedented, massive scale of clean air action plan. So we have seen significant improvement on the air quality in Beijing and in many other cities in China. Having said that, the mission have not been accomplished yet. Prior to this sandstorm, we have experienced a whole week of smoggy days, and it just shows that the emission volume is still quite high, and actually there has been a rebound of energy-intensive industries. So the 2030 and 2060 carbon neutrality commitment made by President Xi came at a very critical moment, because at that moment, many local regions want to have some relaxation so that they can have a recover from the pandemic hit. But this pledge means that all these regions have to review their their planning,
Right.
and the 14th five-year plan have been revised to integrate all this carbon target. So this is, we have seen a whole new dynamic in China.
Ma Jun, Director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, thank you so much. He's also the founder of the Blue Map app. I hope the app will show things will get better soon. Thank you, sir. Welcome back. This is World Insight. United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin will visit Japan and South Korea this week. Blinken and Austin are expected to be on a mission to take up issues that they have already touched upon in phone calls with their Japanese and Korean counterparts. Those include the strengthening alliances and the push to denuclearize the DPRK. Blinken will return from Seoul to the United States and join Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan for talks in Anchorage with their Chinese counterparts. And what does the Biden administration's Asia policy mean to the region? Let's loop in our panelists. For more in New York, Daniel Russell, Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy with the Asia Society Policy Institute. And in Seoul, Yoon-Jung Lim, the Associate Professor and Director of the Office of International Affairs and Public Relations with Kongji National University. Last but not least, in Shanghai, Wu Xinbo, Director of the Center for American Studies with Fudan University. Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to see you. It's going to be a big week for Asia. Mr. Russell, what can be achieved?
It is a big week, and it builds on the first ever summit of the Quad, the four leaders who met late last week. These are democratic partners in the Indo-Pacific, and I think what's interesting is they focused on solutions, on getting things done. So specifically, how they can support Southeast Asian countries sharing vaccines and climate and tech working groups and so on. And lastly, I'd say the fact that they've scheduled a meeting with their Chinese counterparts, that is to say, the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken. I think it shows that the emphasis that the Biden administration has placed on allies and partners and other democratic governments doesn't mean that they intend to exclude China or to ignore China. So there is a lot going on.
Right. Professor Wu, from China's perspective, is it about rallying the allies against China together?
Well, at least that shows that Biden wants to reach out to allies and partners before sitting down with China. So this coincides with his overall line of thinking that the U.S. should deal with China from a position of strength. Of course, it's a different question whether allies, partners, they will just follow the U.S. When it comes to the China policy. That's a different issue.
All right. Well, you kicked the ball beautifully already to the court of Ms. Yoon-Jung Lim. Ms. Lim, I have to go to you about that.
Again, this visit is more than just meaningful. Our biggest concern was what if the new administration, new Biden administration, is just almost obsessed with the domestic affairs, and what if they don't have enough energy to make enough commitment in this region, because other regions too, for example, Middle East, or these days Myanmar situations is very bad too, and that they have to take care of their European partners as well. So our concern, one of the biggest concern was what if again that they less prioritize this region. As long as that was our major concern, I think not only just Seoul, of course Tokyo, partner countries here in these regions are, I think, excited and welcoming this visit. Again, this does not necessarily mean that we are trying to make something, very against the China, but still we need to coordinate, and still we need to narrow down our already widened gap, especially between Tokyo and Seoul and Tokyo.
Professor Wu, one of the things people have been talking about here in China is wondering whether the common ground, so-called, between the United States and some of the allies, such as South Korea and Japan, is about, China, or what the U.S. would call so-called assertive China, and then nuclear issue, for example, concerning the DPRK, and then also the pandemic. Whether China has become a common topic among all.
That differs from country to country in Northeast Asia. For Japan, I think the U.S. and Japan may have more common in talking about China when it comes to the rise of China and its implication for the region, like the maritime dispute between China and Japan, Taiwan issue, South China Sea issue, and the like. But for South Korea, I guess China is not really their primary concern. Their primary concern is relations with DPRK. So in that regard, I think China actually can play, as it did in the past, a constructive role. For Japan and for South Korea, they have somewhat different perspective on China, and that will shape the agenda of the 2+2 meeting with the United States.
And Mr. Russell, what's likely to be the flavor in those talks, for example, with South Korea and with Japan from Washington's perspective, current Washington?
The significance of the visit, in part, is that it makes good on Joe Biden's promise that he was going to consult partners and allies before acting, before making the decisions. So to say that the meetings are about China or about North Korea, I think are misleading. There'll be an affirmative agenda. What is it that the United States and Japan, the United States and Korea, and frankly, trilateral, these three close partners and allies, are trying to build in the region? What is it that they're trying to achieve, and what do they have to do in order to advance those goals?
That's, of course, one of those important layers. The other important layer is what's going to happen in Anchorage. What is on the agenda?
Well, look, I think that it's a very constructive sign that the two most senior national security officials on both sides, on the Chinese side and on the American side, are going to sit down together. I think it's positive. It's positive that they already know each other. You know, this is an asset. I would think of this meeting as a chance to begin a strategic discussion of the respective worldviews of the two leaders of the two sides, the priorities of each side. This is a chance to explain. It's a chance to listen. I don't think it's a negotiation that's going to be delving into the toughest of problems and getting answers. I think it's more of an exploration of the issues, of the positions. And look, I know Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan very well.
Right.
They are good listeners. They can do more than talk. And I also know Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi quite well. I hope that they won't just recite official talking points. I hope they'll be candid in explaining what the thinking is in Beijing. And of course, the goal is for both sides to listen to each other, not to argue with each other.
Professor Wu, your take, and what are the topics on the agenda from China's perspective? What can be discussed? What can be listened to?
Specifically, I think first they will talk about the issues, either the trade and economic issues or other political issues. And both sides will express their opinions about their position and also the kind of red lines on those issues. But I don't think they are going to solve these issues. They are going to have a very candid exchange of views on those difficult issues. Secondly, both sides are expected to somehow work out a roadmap for this relationship. What are we going to down the road from now to the end of this year? So if they can, that should be a very positive signal coming out of this meeting. The third is that I hope that both sides can make some progress on what we call the low-hanging fruits. For example, we agree, both sides would agree to cooperate on dealing with climate change, fighting COVID-19, facilitating people-to-people exchanges. So these are not highly controversial issues on both sides, and it's easier for both sides to reach agreement. If they can come up with these agreements, that will also again send a positive signal for the future relations.
Ms. Lim, how important is it for Seoul, at least, to see Beijing and Washington in direct talk and consult their agenda? What does it mean for Seoul?
Oh, it means a lot, as it does have a tremendously important meanings. So as long as the two superpowers can meet each other and can have constructive dialogues, which is definitely a good sign, especially for South Korea-like country. Of course, we have a security military alliance relationship with the US, but at the same time, China is number one trade partner for us. So as long as we have multi-dimensional situations, I think all Korean people are looking forward to a more constructive dialogues between Beijing and Washington, and Washington and Beijing.
$1.9 trillion that has already been passed by the U.S. Congress. Unprecedented, of course, the number and also the way it is going to be used. Meanwhile, China just held its annual political season, in which some of the most difficult and probably challenging issues that needs to have good international communications have just been done. Of course, there were different voices coming from parts of the world suggesting whether they agree with that or not. China believes it is internal affairs. But anyway, means both have, in a way, finished some of the most important agendas they have in mind for their domestic plan. Now, here's the thing. Whether they will be able to focus on their common ground as a result of this.
There is an interesting symmetry, though, Tianwei, in terms of the domestic agenda and the calendar for both Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. In July, the party will celebrate its 100th anniversary. Next February, Beijing will host the Winter Olympics. And then at the end of next year, of course, is the all-important 20th Party Congress. That's a major political series of milestones on the Chinese side. On the American side, of course, we have a new president who's getting started, who is committed to a program of domestic renewal. Certainly, the first cycle will run until the U.S. midterm elections in November of 2022, the same time as the 20th Party Congress. So there's a symmetry also on the issues. You know, Xi Jinping talks about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and that's exactly what Joe Biden has promised: American renewal, to make America more competitive. And that means dealing effectively with COVID. It means getting the U.S. economy back into high gear. It means addressing some of the serious social issues that have gone unresolved, investing in research and development infrastructure. So here again, we see a certain amount of parallelism. So I think, you know, to be optimistic here, you can see that there is space for the kind of healthy competition that can bring out the best in both sides, right? The emergence of China as a peer competitor has been a wake-up call for America. Now, the way that Donald Trump responded to that wake-up call was very ineffective, but there's reason to believe that the way that the Biden administration is signaling that it's going to compete could be a very healthy and very productive form of competition, could be very effective.
Professor Wu, let me go to the real expert like you to help us understand how is Beijing looking at this stage, the nature of this relationship between China and the United States. Earlier, the word cooperation has been very much emphasized. Then, during the annual press conference, by the Chinese Foreign Minister, State Councilor Wang Yi, he also mentioned several words, both competition and cooperation. And he said, of course, they're not going to the conflict and rivalry. And then we also see Mr. Blinken, the Secretary of State, mentioned in his latest speech about this relationship, he used all these words, cooperation, competition, rivalry, and everything. So, so it seems that both are, massaging the messages, while at the same time trying to figure out really what's going on and what can be the nature.
When we talk about China-U.S. relations, there's always a challenge. Telling the difference between rhetoric and policy and practice.
Like that.
In rhetoric, it's easy to define the nature of this relationship. It's going to be a very competitive relationship with both confrontational and cooperative dimensions. So kind of like what Tony Blinken mentioned. For the Chinese side, like it or not, we have to acknowledge, we have to recognize, we have to accept that strategic competition between two countries is going to be a long-term and even dominant phenomenon in this relationship. But at the same time, China also wants to make sure competition is benign, is manageable, is controllable. And also, in spite of competition, we should be able to cooperate as much as possible.
Right.
But now, I think the real issue is as a policy issue, as is at the practical level. Now, as we are going to move down the road in this relationship, where are the priorities for this relationship?
Right.
Where are the areas we should compete? Where are the areas we should cooperate? And what's the percentage of these two different denominators? I think neither side have a clear mind about this roadmap, to say the least, of a consensus on the issue. So my hope is that after the 2+2 meeting between China and the United States, we come up with an understanding or consensus.
How much difference that would make when you know a country compared to when you don't know a country? How much it would make if we start from the young people goodwill?
Well, Tianwei, thank you. I'm a huge believer in the importance of nurturing people-to-people connections, particularly among young people, and particularly involving exchange programs and language learning programs, because it gives a very revealing window into another culture, and it makes it that much harder for negative stereotypes about the other to take hold. As a diplomat, I used to describe the people-to-people network, not only students and academics, but business people and local government officials and sports figures, et cetera, as a safety net under the tightrope that government officials and policymakers, leaders walk. If they fall off and things go badly in the relationship, you want to have this net, this safety net of strong people-to-people connections to keep the relationship from hitting the ground. However, even after decades of close exchanges between the United States and China, we found that this safety net got ripped apart by serious concerns on both sides about the other's behavior.
Ms. Lim, even though you're not talking about China-U.S. relations, but I'm sure you are a very ardent observer.
Yeah, I visited again to China many times, and I gave some special lecture to the Chinese young students too. I saw lots of all this, how you say, this passion to learn about and to know more about American culture or American politics from the Chinese young people. The other way around too. I was teaching politics, East Asian politics to the American students. They also want to learn more about, again, the Asia, China as well. But as Mr. Russell said, of course, it creates a, how would you say, very good ground for the relationship. But sadly, it might not be really the sufficient or the determining factor whenever we see the frictions or overall competitions between the two. So understanding better is, I think, a good thing.
Professor Wu, final thoughts also from you about that.
I spent many years doing my research in the United States. I benefited a lot, and I have always tried to share with my students at Fudan University my observation of the United States. And also, when we talk to the Chinese students who come back from studying in the United States, or to the American students who spend some time in China, one important thing is that they have become more nuanced, more sophisticated in understanding the other country. In the world of Daniel Russell, they are less stereotyped in thinking about the other side. So that is very much different from the information you get from media. So yes, people-to-people exchanges cannot solve all the problems. But think about if we do not have this kind of people-to-people exchanges, especially among the younger generation, I think that will be a disaster for the future of this very important relationship.
And you're watching World Insight. Coming up, Syria comes to grips with a decade of ceaseless conflict and humanitarian crisis. Any end to the war in sight? That's up for discussion. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. On the 10th anniversary of Syria's civil war, it reaches a grim milestone this month. Back in 2011, the situation quickly deteriorated from local protests to a full-scale war, leaving a devastating humanitarian crisis that persists a decade later. The conflict has left more than 380,000 people dead, devastated cities, and drawn in other countries. Currently, almost 12 million Syrians, half the pre-war population, are displaced inside and outside Syria. In just over a year, an economic crisis, jobless losses due to the pandemic, and soaring food prices have weighed down on Syrians who have been displaced and wary of a decade of conflict. So what will it take to end the war, and any political solutions in sight? Let's turn to our panelists. For more on the Syrian conflict, we have in London Amar Wakaf, who is the founder and director of the think tank Gnosos, and the Syrian political analyst. In Moscow, Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. Last but not least, in Beijing, Zhou Rong, senior analyst from Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies with Renmin University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. 10 years on, any solution in sight? Mr. Wakaf.
The only solution is the way lots of Syrians see it, is for the Syrian state to remain stable, not to be toppled. We have to remember that 10 years ago, a segment of Syrians decided that they wanted to do an uprising. They saw opportunity in the Arab Spring. They thought they could bring democracy and better governance and everything. But there were so many underlying issues in their movement that forced another segment of the Syrians to be either reluctant or to stand against that movement. So what we effectively have in Syria is a state of two segments of the Syrian people wanting two different things. The only thing that the Syrians has managed to do so far is to keep the state on its feet. And that gives a lot of platform for speedier recovery later on, should a solution happen. Now, we have lots of external interference that is coming up, but everyone needs to realize that toppling the government is not going to happen. And then everybody needs to sit at the table and discuss how to bring themselves back.
But the thing is, the sanctions are still going on, Mr. Sloboda. Now, the U.S. sanctions against Syria, even at a time when the Syrian economy is extremely hurt and people's lives are absolutely devastating. The EU also is trying to reimpose the sanctions in the coming May. So what does that mean for Syria and Syria looking for a solution?
Yeah, there's no solution in sight to the Syrian crisis because despite regime change via jihadi proxy being prevented over the course of the 10-year conflict, there are a number of problems. Syria's territorial integrity is shattered. There are opposing armies, one from Turkey and another from the United States and its allies, illegally, militarily occupying Syrian territory, large swaths of it. Turkey and its jihadi proxies in the north, and the US and its allies and its Kurdish proxies in the resource-rich east, where they are sitting on and denying the majority of the Syrian people access to their own oil and wheat, which is compounding the economic crisis that the Syrian government in Damascus, which controls the largest swaths of the Syrian population, is facing because of US and allied sanctions on the country.
I see.
And this has been even further compounded by recent Israeli military attacks on Iran's attempt to ship oil into the country, washing their own beaches in the oil of their attacks.
Yeah. Now, the new administration inside the United States, Mr. Joe, has been taking the serious issue of Syria very seriously. But the question is whether they are likely to bring solutions with the current approach it has. Mainly we still have to wait and see to see what is exactly the strategy, Mr. Zhou.
Right now, I can say the best of the worst options right now is extended stalemate. That is to say, right now, the people in Syria are not suffering so much about the war, but they're suffering economic crisis. But right now, they have, if United States intend to do something for the future peace and stability of Syria, they have to invite all the partners concerned, interested group concerned, including Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Syria Assad government, as well as the United States and some of the Arab countries, to stay together to see what we can do for the future of Syria. But right now, I really think the best of the worst option is to continue the stalemate.
Very sad, but that is the reality. Having said that, the world has been changing so much. From the time when the Syria civil war broke out to today, we see the Middle East, where is it in terms of priority of American policy? We also see the changes of America itself, credibility, and its approach to the rest of the world. We also see some interesting changes in the relationship between U.S. and its allies, including with the Europeans and those in the Middle East. So, Mr. Vakart, given all these changes, what would that mean for whether there will be any solution, and what will be the nature of that solution, so-called the best of the worst choice?
We have witnessed from since the election of Joe Biden is that there was a slight change. Back in November, 4 Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, held a gathering to discuss the Syrian issue.
Right.
And apparently they were discussing, how to move forward. And one could argue that this meeting has been arranged with ideas coming from the Syrian government in mind. And the theory is that those countries, along with the Syrian government, would find some sort of a middle solution that they could take as an initiative to the new American administration. This was back in November. This meeting took place late November, assuming that when President Biden would take office, this initiative could be presented. What we have witnessed in the past few days is that Russia came along. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, visited UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. and he made discussions about how to move forward. Now, presumably, what we've heard from those officials in the news conferences was something like bringing back Syria to its Arab neighborhood, and that would involve, as Sergei Lavrov put it, Minister Lavrov, bringing back Syria to its seat in the Arab League. Now, who would oppose that naturally? It would be Qatar, backed by Turkey, which explains why Sergei Lavrov visited Qatar, to probably see how they can mediate, what would it take for Qatar not to veto Syria's coming back. So we're thinking there is a movement that is taking place, and everybody seems happy. So I think there is a bit of optimism in the air at the moment in terms of a regional-backed, Arab-backed step forward on solving the Syrian solution that could be taken to Washington. And most importantly, the UAE Foreign Minister, Abdullah bin Zayed, said something about the sanctions. He said, this cannot continue, or we cannot move forward as long as the Caesar Act is as it is at the moment, or implemented as it is at the moment, signaling they want some change in Washington as well.
Mr. Sloboda, because of the changes that we mentioned earlier, there seems to be much more than just how the issue of Syria is likely to be dealt with, because we have seen the priorities of different countries changes, and we also see this multilateral approach, how it's been evolving as a result of geopolitics and priority setting at the domestic agenda. So once again, how will that have an impact on what we have been talking about from the very beginning, the so-called solution to Syria crisis?
The U.S. Will continue to play spoiler in Syria, preventing the unification and economic recovery of the state, because its goal is not to see Syria stabilized. Having failed at regime change, its goal is the eternal destabilization and fracturization of Syria, because its primary geopolitical goal is not Syria itself, but weakening Iran. And Syria is seen as an ally of Iran. Further, the U.S. is very, very concerned as a hegemonic power with their prestige, and they cannot have been seen as losing an international conflict to Russia, much less Iran as well. So they will continue to destabilize the situation. I see no hope for the U.S. ending this policy. The Joe Biden policy already is a continuation of the Trump policy, which was only a variation on the Obama policy. U.S. foreign policy is constant with regard to the importance of destabilizing Syria for the U.S.'s geopolitical hegemonic goals. And there are powerful domestic political forces in the United States, bipartisan, and also the very powerful Arab and Israeli lobbies against anything that would alleviate economic or military pressure on Syria.
But what is the ambition of Russia in this sense? Some would ask, since you are based in Moscow. Briefly, Mr. Sloboda.
Yeah, the goal of Russia is the exact opposite. It is to stabilize Syria, to get the opposition forces, Turkey and the United States, to withdraw their forces, and to attempt to get the international community, particularly the Arab community, but others, China certainly as well, to assist in the economic recovery of the country. But Russia will maintain a military presence in Syria as the guarantor of Syrian sovereignty and in territorial integrity long into the future, as it has several times in the last century in the past.
Finally, before we go, I want to ask the other two gentlemen very briefly. For some time, regime change has been this very hot issue. Regime change here, regime change there. But then there were consequences, as we see in Iraq. Now, we have another issue, Syria. Look at it, 10 years already. And now priorities of countries have changed because we're facing pandemics, the economies are bad. What lessons really does this 10-year tell us at this point? If we can be just a little bit clear in our mind, what is that lessons?
The lessons learned is the cost of resisting U.S. hegemony in the world and its machinations is extremely high.
Okay. Mr. Joe.
Very striking lessons is Syria war, also around the terrorists. You know, before Syria war, there's no Daesh, but right now Daesh used to straddle Iraq and Syria for almost 2 years. So if the external power just interfere with Syria domestic politics, so what happened? The catastrophe, the disaster suffered by Syrian people. So right now, even the war went down, but we can see the people still suffering a lot.
Amma Vakarov, Mark Sloboda, Joe Rome, thank you so much. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching.